Good evening, everyone. Before we commence, I'd like to acknowledge that we meet tonight on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and that this land has been invaded and stolen and sovereignty in it never ceded. I pay my respects to the elders of the Kulin Nation, past, present and future, and to any other elders and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who we have with us this evening. I acknowledge the ongoing harm and damage that is being done to First Nations people by the continuing effects of colonisation, systemic racism and white fragility in this country, and recognise the strength, resilience and survival of our First Nations people. My name is Jessie Taylor. I'm the President of Liberty Victoria, and it's my pleasure to see so many of you here tonight at this event, which is co-hosted between Liberty Victoria and the Wheeler Centre. If you're not familiar with Liberty Victoria, I encourage you to look us up online on social media, grab some info or a membership form or something on the way out. In July, we're having an awards dinner where we're presenting human rights awards to the wonderful Debbie Kilroy, whom you may have seen on Australian Story this week, and also to Nagaji, a fantastic collaboration and product of the Koori Youth Council. We are really proud to present tonight's event alongside the Wheeler Centre. The offence of public drunkenness has disproportionate and devastating impacts on Aboriginal people, and we are thrilled to have an all-Indigenous panel here to discuss the push towards its abolition. There's a petition on the tables up the back, which no doubt you'll hear about throughout the evening. That petition is being led by the family of Tanya Day, and I'm sure you will all sign it on the way out. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the moderator of this evening's panel, who will then introduce the rest of the panel in turn. Charlene Musk joined the Human Rights Law Centre team in February 2017, working in the Indigenous Rights Unit. She's an Aboriginal lawyer descended from the Larrakia people of Darwin. She was the first Aboriginal person to graduate from the then Northern Territory University, now Charles Darwin University, and to be admitted to the Supreme Court of the Northern Territory. Her achievements since then have been numerous, but we don't have time to go into them. But please welcome Charlene and the panel.
Yes, thank you. I should just start by acknowledging too that we are meeting here in Naarm. We're meeting on stolen lands, the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, people who have not ceded sovereignty like my friend before spoke about, and who maintain an ongoing connection and responsibility for the lands and waters that surround us. I pay my respects as well to the elders past, present, and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us tonight. There are some seats that are reserved for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. If anyone is sitting further down the back, we'd invite you to come forward. And perhaps a bit later, if there is still some vacancies, people can move forward so we can actually see some of your faces. It's quite dark back there. So thank you all for being here tonight to hear from a panel of incredibly passionate advocates and leaders in the ongoing fight to achieve social justice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Our panel bring a wealth of experience and expertise, particularly when it comes to some of the hard issues that we're going to discuss tonight, including, for me, really delving into the impact of some discriminatory and unjust laws that continue to have an impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in Victoria. So without further ado, I'd like to just introduce our panel. Right next to me is April Watson. April's a proud Yorta Yorta woman, Wemba Wemba and Barra Barapa woman. She's the daughter of Tanya Day, a proud Yorta Yorta grandmother who died in police custody back in 2017. April has worked in a number of different roles in the community sector, particularly around health and in education. Next to April is Eddie Cabillo. Eddie's from the Northern Territory just like me. He's also Larrakia, but Wadigan and Central Oronta. Eddie has a Bachelor and Masters of Law. He's worked for over 20 years at the grassroots of Aboriginal affairs. Eddie's legal career included working for the Northern Territory Legal Aid Commission, Northern Territory Government. He served as the chairperson of both the Northern Territory Aboriginal Justice Agency, where I used to work, and the Aboriginal Justice Advisory Committee. In 2010, he was appointed the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner for the Northern Territory. He's been the Executive Officer of NATSLs, and he was announced the National Indigenous Legal Profession of the Year back in 2015. And over on the end is Nayuka Gori. Nayuka is Gunai Kurnai Gunjamara, Wurundjeri and Yorta Yorta. Freelance and comedian television writer. Nayuka's writing centres on black, feminist and queer politics. Nayuka co-wrote and performed in the upcoming 3rd season of Black Comedy. So please welcome our panel tonight. And before we get started with the amazing panel, I just want to provide some context to the discussion, at least frame what we're going to be talking about tonight. On 5 December 2017, Yorta woman Tanya Day was taken off a train in Castlemaine. The V-line officer who stopped the train called police, and Tanya was arrested, locked up for being drunk in a public place. In police custody, Tanya fell down a number of times and hit her head. The blows caused a brain hemorrhage, for which she later died in custody some days later. Tanya was just 55 years of age when she died. She was a much loved mother, grandmother, auntie, and respected Aboriginal community member. What we know is that laws in Victoria currently criminalise behaviour of some people, but it's completely overlooked for others. People do not die in custody coming home from the Melbourne Cup. Almost 30 years ago, the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody concluded that Aboriginal people die in custody at a rate which is totally unacceptable and which would not be tolerated if it occurred in the non-Aboriginal community. And this occurs because Aboriginal people are grossly overrepresented in custody. Too many Aboriginal people are in custody too often. A key recommendation from that Royal Commission to address the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in the justice system was to abolish the offence of public drunkenness. Over the past 3 decades, in addition to the Royal Commission, numerous expert reports have recommended exactly the same, that the offence of public drunkenness be abolished and that it be replaced with a community health response. Victoria is one of only 2 states that have failed to repeal this offence. Tonight we'll unpack why successive Victorian governments have failed to act and why it's so important for this Andrews government to finally take action to right this wrong. So now I'll turn it over to the panel and start with April. April, you and your family tragically lost your mother, Tanya Day. Could you really talk to the circumstances that led to her death and also what your family hope will come from the coronial inquiry?
Yeah, so as you said, it was on the 5th of December in 2017. Mum was travelling on a V-line train from Echuca to Melbourne. During that time, Mum had actually fallen asleep on a train and was awoken by a V-line conductor. And he used the word unruly, so he deemed Mum unruly when he called the police. Mum was then arrested for public drunkenness. She was placed in a cell at Castlemaine Police Station. So during that time, the police had failed in their duty of care to provide Mum, adequate, human decency and just even the adequate checks that require for them in their own policies and procedures and their protocols. So the one thing that they're meant to follow, they didn't. During that time, and it was actually really early on, it wasn't that much long into when they placed her in the cell, Mum had fallen multiple times, and you could see straight away that those effects had moved along really quickly. During that time that Mum was in the cell, they never once actually notified us about how serious her condition was. They had used the phrase that Mum had had a knock to the noggin. So from the moment that Mum had entered the police cell, they, were withholding on some pretty important facts about where Mum's condition was. By the time that they had actually gone in and properly checked her, she was unconscious and they had to call an ambulance. So by the time that Mum had left the police station, she was completely unconscious. They took her to Bendigo Hospital, which they couldn't really do much there for her because of the condition that she was in. She was then transported to St Vincent's, where they, had to do surgery to save her life, but unfortunately that wasn't enough and Mum didn't regain consciousness and she died 17 days later. So that was a pretty gruelling process, as, we obviously, blackfellas don't feel safe around the police because of the history, but at the same time when they're telling us, so, you know, your mum's okay, she's in our care, we're going to make sure that, you know, when she's sober enough, we're going to put her on a train and get her to Melbourne. You know, all the while mum was actually in a cell by herself, she wasn't being checked on, and they just left her in a terrible state, and that's exactly why we are left right now without our mum. So a lot of our campaigning has been about making sure that mum gets the justice that she deserves, and, you know, just to make sure that no other family goes through what we do, and that, you know, someone's held accountable for what's happened to her, and, you know, awareness is brought around, you know, the need to decriminalise this law, but as well as the rising numbers of Aboriginal deaths in custody. So, you know, we're fighting for justice for mum, but we're also fighting for all the other families in the mob that have sadly lost their lives. And we just hope that everything that we're doing is actually going to make a difference, and mum's death wasn't in vain.
Thanks, April. And there is the coronial hearing. It's part heard, and the coroner is going to consider further evidence later in the year. When is the hearing resuming?
So we actually, during the directions hearings, we have put in submissions for systemic racism to be included. That's, to us, is a major factor as to how mum was treated and to ultimately led to her death. You know, that's not, for us, it's very clear, and for a lot of other people and, you know, cases that have similar to mum's, it has been a racist issue. So it was originally meant to have a decision, I think it was about a week or two ago, but that's been pushed back into June. So we've got our inquest starting on August the 26th and pushing through till September, but we've actually requested a couple more days because we don't think the days that they've provided is adequate enough to be able to reach through, you know, all the witnesses and the evidence that's been provided, and we want to make sure that no one rushes the process, because this is about getting the truth, because we still haven't gotten to the bottom of what actually happened to mum. So that should, you know, go over a 3-week time frame, and we're hoping that, you know, hopefully soon we have a decision back on the systemic racism.
Yeah. And at the early stages of the coronial inquiry, the coroner flagged a recommendation that she will be making at the end of this inquiry, and that is to the Victorian government that they repeal the offence of public drunkenness. Moving on, I think, now to Eddie, noting that that's been flagged from the outset by the coroner, and I think it's been all of our experience and really observations that there has been a consistent pattern of governments failing to act on recommendations from key independent reports. There's been the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, there's been the ALRC Pathways to Justice. What do you see as behind this failure to act, particularly when Aboriginal people's rights and often their lives are at stake?
Thank you. Just want to acknowledge we're on country, and to the elders and past and present, particularly to young emerging leaders here. Look, it's 28 years since the deaths in custody. 339 recommendations. 22 years since the Bringing Them Home report. I was involved with the recent Northern Territory Royal Commission, 227 recommendations. So, and this time of year it's the Reconciliation Week, the NAIDOC Week, and as an Indigenous person you get tired of discussing this issue. Most of us work in this space, and we combat this all the time. Just recently the Indigenous Legal Assistance Program, which the Aboriginal Legal Services are funded by, has a review said that it's a well worth funding service that provided, and that they should continue funding it in a separate bucket. But now they've mainstreamed it, and it could eventually move away, which goes right against the Royal Commission in Deaths in Custody, which stipulated that we should adequately fund these organisations, which they haven't been adequately funded since they've been, initiated. So basically, just the other day I heard Gillian Trigg, the former Australian Human Rights Commission President, talk about this issue, and she said, we're having so many reviews now and inquiries from government, and governments are just ignoring these recommendations. So she's not specifically talking about Indigenous ones, and basically they're just ignoring evidence that is produced for them to follow. And that's got to mean something to Australia. For Indigenous people, we just continually lobby and advocate, and we're only 3% of the population, and we need our non-Indigenous friends to basically stand up. And I think, that's where we're at the present time in this country. If we look at the stats, we're 3% of the population, we're 28% of the prison population. Indigenous men are 11 times more likely to be imprisoned. Our female Indigenous women are 15 times more. Our youth are 28 times more, and it goes on and on. So it's not too much more that Indigenous people can do. It's more about what the rest of society in this country can do. Since the deaths in custody, there's been 409 more deaths in custody. And there's been coronials for nearly every one of them. So there's more recommendations there that we're ignoring. And I was just speaking just before to April that I was actually at the last hearing, and there was like over 35 lawyers for all the government agencies there, and basically, they know that the system's broke. What else can Indigenous Australia do?
It's a terrible indictment, but it's the truth. It's the truth. It's our reality every day, isn't it?
Well, we need our non-Indigenous friends to assist us. It's at crisis points for our people. We've been exterminated. We've been assimilated, and we're still here. Our population is still growing, but our women are last decade have been 50% increase in incarceration. Our men are already there, and so our children are then, they're on dual orders. They're on child protection orders as well as juvenile justice. And the research says that if you're on child protection orders, you're going to end up in prison.
Yeah. Now, Yuka, help us. You've been a strong voice for equality and justice for Aboriginal people. You've highlighted the experiences of Aboriginal people suffering as a direct result of government laws and policies. Do you believe we can achieve change? And if so, what do you see are the levers?
I guess I think it's like define change. So in terms of, so there are three different, in terms of public drunkenness, there's so it's in the Summary Offences Act, drunk in a public place, drunk and disorderly in a public place, and drunk and behaving in a riotous or disorderly manner. So if the change that we're after is changing that legislation and decriminalising those behaviours, then I think, that's quite achievable in terms of changing the legislation. It's a matter of making it, for politicians to change the law, it's about making it in their best interest to do what you want. And so in terms of levers for that, I'm a writer, so I'm concerned with how things are communicated. And I think it's very possible to achieve that change, but I'm interested in what happens after that. Yeah. Because I think the way that I look at this isn't about only public drunkenness. This is about wanting to criminalise black people. And so if that's what we're talking about, I think it's going to take a lot. I think we need to, it's not just about calling, I think particularly organisations that are tied to government funding, they tend to be quite restrained in what they say, but I think we need to start thinking a bit beyond that. So, and that also takes citizens as well. So we need movements to really call for what we really need. And also I think being strategic and having a bit of a game plan, like what happens when we do change this, because I do think it will change. It makes sense, and we're one of the last states or territories to not change, but I'm interested in what happens after and not losing sight of the bigger picture in that. But also I think, and we've just come out of a pretty terrible budget announcement from this government. So I think it also, another lever is the community sector, like black and not black or mainstream organisations, because this is fundamentally about police and and the role that they play in society. And if police are there to manage that sort of band-aid stuff of inequity, then it's on the community, it's also on the community, mainstream and otherwise, and peak bodies to start calling that stuff out. We had $1.8 billion injected into new prisons, and also commitments to more police officers. Like, that is a huge problem. And that ultimately affects us as blackfellas. If $1.8 billion, what are we? Black people are 28% of the prison population down here. Then 28% of $1.8 billion is dedicated to our incarceration. That's a lot of money. That's money that could have been spent on mental health stuff, social housing, public housing. So I think we need to be calling this stuff out. And obviously the media plays a huge role in that.
Yeah.
And I think, and what we've really been centering around Mum's campaign is we're not asking to abolish this law and to leave it. We're asking to replace it, with a health alternative so our people are taken care of and that we're not dying. So a health alternative, that could look like a sobering up centre where our people are taken to a culturally safe environment where, they're monitored effectively by blackfellas or by anyone who's willing to actually do the job, and just making sure that they're not at risk. It's as simple as the police, actually doing their job for once and just driving that person home to their family member or taking them to a hospital. They say Mum was so intoxicated that they were worried is why they took her into custody. Well, if she was that intoxicated, she should have been taken to a hospital. And that has happened time and time again, that they're placing our mob in unsafe situations and they're not even aware of the underlying health issues that blackfellas face. They know about our life expectancy, about our health issues, about the gap, but that is not on their mind because we are now just put in a box that we're drunks, we're this, we're that. So we're just placed in a cell and we're left as is. So, they can say what they want about this law, but we know that it is used by the Victorian police to target our people. It has shown that time and time again, which is why the majority of our people are arrested for that. So it's a quarter of people that are arrested for that law are Aboriginal, and we make up 0.8% of the Victorian population. So you got to see that really is a tool that obviously they don't want to give that up. They don't want to give up a tool that they can use to still criminalise our people. So, we just hope that we get the support from the government to be able to make those changes to keep our people safe.
Yeah. Kind of leads into the next question, April, which is directed at you. Aboriginal people are drastically overrepresented in the criminal justice system and at every stage. And as you said with the statistics around public drunkenness, if the statistics show this clear disparity, what are really the reasons behind this?
It's the system that is built on systemic racism. We know that have been affected since the moment of colonisation, and intergenerational trauma, and we know trauma creates trauma, and that has trickled down for us, but the racism has trickled down for them and for the government and for how they have built their system. So that ignorance and them trying to constantly hold us back and oppress our people, they don't want to give us self-determination. And it's something that we need to be able to keep our people safe and to thrive.
Exactly. Eddie, maybe there is ways that we can help ourselves. I know we seem it's always about, why don't you come up with the solutions, Aboriginal people? What does self-determination really mean here in this space, and how can we be improving our own lot?
We've got to remember first that John Howard removed the policy of self-determination for Aboriginal people and talked more about mainstreaming and things like that, rather than self-determining. And he removed ATSIC, which was our, peak body that advocated for Indigenous people. So we must put that at the forefront there. And ever since then, the policy of self-determination in this country, even though we've, begrudgingly accepted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which has a whole heap of articles in there on self-determination, we definitely have moved away from that in this country. In saying that, however, and like I said, the Aboriginal Legal Services, for example, started itself because they noticed the issues that our people were facing around public drunkenness and various other move-on laws that, derive out of colonisation, as April said, and basically it's about moving on people that, they want to see in spaces, and that technically that usually is people of colour, and unfortunately Indigenous people are predominantly in the low socioeconomic bracket, are in homeless and in the face of government and who want to be moved on. But other peoples of colours are also faced with that, and then to a lesser degree, non-Indigenous people who are homeless face some of the issues that we face as well. So it's technically not a black issue, but unfortunately the majority of our people and that are homeless and I'm struggling with socioeconomics of this country. But in saying that, as a former National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Service Executive Officer, I've travelled most of the country and watched what our organisations do. For example, from the Northern Territory, as you'd know, Charlena, there's Indigenous communities that have developed their own systems in their communities, elders programs, law and justice programs, various other programs where they're utilising their own welfare money to organise, things for kids to keep them entertained in remote locations, employment, media learnings, building water parks in the desert, things like that are really, going beyond what governments try and do with their pilot programs that only last a year, and once they start developing, they get rid of them. Our people are very resilient and really trying to combat some of the issues that are facing them. I worked on the Indigenous Governance Awards, and we travelled, in the Western Desert, major cities, and all our people are really doing these programs on their own backs. Mothers working with schools and various other non-Indigenous peoples to assist to develop such programs which don't get no government backing or assistance in any shape or form. So, that's what self-determination is about, and our people are getting on with it, but we don't hear about those stories. We just hear all the negative stories, and that's the problem. And there's a lot of Indigenous people out there doing a great work and trying to assist. People are on welfare card. 80% of their monies are being quarantined. You live in a remote location, whether it be rural here in Western Victoria or wherever. Prices for to live and for your children and that are just when you only got 20% to spend, it's very difficult to survive. So so I think self-determination, that Indigenous people are doing that, and without any assistance. But I think we need to really, like everyone's saying, let's listen to Indigenous people. They know what's best for themselves, and they know what works for them, and it gets frustrating because we're not listening, and we've got a roadmap with the Royal Commission that talks about public drunkenness and discusses all these issues and gives government a whole roadmap to work through these, but we just don't listen.
Can I jump in?
Yeah,
as
go
well?
for it.
I think I don't know if self-determination is the right word, but I think a lot of people, so I'm thinking about the police and what that has to do with self-determination. I'm thinking about events where, well, if we think about why people call the police, I think there's, you could probably see in your own family, in your own communities, situations where you decide to not call the police, or you realise like there are things that I can do to de-escalate the situation right now. I don't need to call the police. And I think that, I don't know if that's self-determination, but realising like, no, we have the skills, like my friendship group or my family, we have the skills to deal with whatever this is right now. And so if that's like, that can look like a number of different things, but I think that's a really kind of good interpersonal way to practice that without getting the police involved. And if that's, if someone's, I can't tell that story, but like there are things that we can all do to de-escalate situations without relying on the police. And I think, I don't know if that is self-determination, but there are ways to keep each other accountable without getting the state involved.
But I think I agree with you, but also I think values as well. Community values. I mean, your mum, Melbourne Cup Day. I'm not from Melbourne. In the Northern Territory, we're regarded as heavy drinkers, but Melbourne Cup Day. In the Northern Territory, we had an intervention apparently because Aboriginal people are big drinkers, but majority of Aboriginal people who live on remote communities don't drink, and
less than 50%.
Yeah. And we had an intervention that put all these alcohol restrictions everywhere, but people aren't aware that already all the Aboriginal land under Land Rights Act is alcohol free. So we have all these, guises that Aboriginal people are bad drinkers and all this sort of stuff. Yeah. But in fact, in the Territory, one of the major issues was the major street where everyone goes to party on the weekends, and that's where the alcohol restrictions initially started, but ended up being placed on all Aboriginal people. And people's values, like you're saying, I was after a conference yesterday, I was at a hotel, and a non-Indigenous guy was asleep, and we had two wines next to him. All the Indigenous people who were there for the conference basically said, "Oh, if that was us, we'd be taken and locked up." And as a former, discrimination commissioner, I've been on values alone by police. I've been pulled up and asked if I'd been drinking, and it's shocking. And as a lawyer, I've sat in court one and sat at the front waiting for my matter to be heard. And I've asked who's my lawyer, and I need to sit behind my lawyer. And 20 years later, I go back working on the Royal Commission, and the same thing happens whilst I'm waiting for someone who's in the dock, and so we could talk to him about a child protection matter. But there are these values that basically comes back to colonialism, that this country was seated on a lie. These laws are ingrained in this country that we need to sit down and reform and acknowledge that there is an issue here. And as a discrimination commissioner in the Northern Territory, we had that many tourists come through the Territory ringing me, asking and complaining about police and how they treated Indigenous people. And I think that's the underlying issue in this country at the moment for our mob and of any people of colour. And I just think unless we're willing to face that, we're not going to have too much change in the near future. And as a person from the Northern Territory, I look to Victoria as growing up as a young lawyer and that, who had all these things in place for Indigenous peoples, protections of their rights. And now to see them with public drunkenness, where I'm from the Northern Territory, they got a 2-kilometre law where only works if you're black, because white fellas can watch the sun go down and have wine and watch the beautiful sunset in the Northern Territory, and nothing happens to them. But if an Aboriginal mob was sitting around having a drink, watching the sunset, we would be all locked up. So, yeah, I find public drunkenness a real race issue, and I think it's not warranted in this country anymore.
I think also, though, with what you're saying, I think something we can tend to do when it comes to any kind of coping mechanism is to pathologise it. And so we have to, I think saying like, oh, less than 50% or whatever, it's this need, we fall into this framing where we have to prove our humanity. And I think we have to, I think there's a role in the media in pushing back on the framing. Like we actually don't have to justify our alcohol to anybody. I don't, and if there are any issues, that's a health issue, I think, but it becomes a way for like, you know, a way for us to be infantilised or whatever. But I think it's kind of dangerous territory to start like justifying like, oh, actually we have higher rates of alcohol abstinence than anyone else or whatever. I think, it's not, we are not the problem here. Like it's, I don't know, it kind of, I worry about that.
Yeah, no, I totally get what you mean.
Yeah, and we're here, like you said, we're justifying ourselves, but, you know, it comes down to the government and the lack of leadership and commitment that they have had towards the Royal Commission, you know. Since 1988, there has been over 10 recommendations to abolish public drunkenness. So they have had recommendation over recommendation to abolish this law and they haven't done it. And we actually don't know how many people have died from this law, but it's a huge number. And, you know, I look back at when they had the Royal Commission, because one of the cases was actually Uncle Harrison Day, which was Mum's uncle, and he was also picked up for a fine for public drinking, so he actually wasn't intoxicated when he was arrested. And then he was placed in a cell and he had an epileptic fit and then he died. So this is another member of the Day family that has sadly lost a family member, and then we jump to 2017 and it has taken, you know, the life of my mother, and now I'm sitting down having a conversation with my cousins about, you know, the campaign and the movement to make sure that, you know, both of our family members are getting the justice and the respect that they deserve. And it's just, you know, it really comes down to, you know, this is what the community wants, this is what the community needs, and this is what we've been asking time and time again, and someone needs to step up and actually, you know, commit to what has come out of that Royal Commission, which they really have not committed to hardly anything.
Yeah. Nayika, and this is kind of, we touched on this earlier in the discussion, is you repeal the laws, what comes in its place? So the question I've got is kind of premised on this. There's often a tension between individual rights and collective interests. What can we as Aboriginal people, and perhaps allies, our friends, our supporters out there, do to ensure that there's not simply more of the same? So an increase in policing powers, an increase in paternalistic laws or policies which are really aimed at our social control and keeping us in our place.
So can you repeat the question? How do we...
So the question's more around how do we just not change the laws and get an increase in police and powers? Because that's, as Eddie and I have experienced in the Northern Territory, rather than just getting rid of the laws, then there's protective custody laws, there's paperless arrest laws, alcohol protection laws, mandatory alcohol treatment laws come in, and it's like a proliferation of laws, and then an increase in policing policies that are around stop drinking, Aboriginal person, and get in your place.
Yeah. So I think this is the danger of only like if we have to be really strategic. Do you know the legal scholar Derek Bell? He's like a critical race theorist and also a legal scholar. He's passed away now. But he's a kind of the grandfather of like Afro-pessimism. And in his like legal scholarship, he says that like his books are about how every major like legal, what's the word when it changes? What was it? The Board of Education v Brown or whatever. That sort of when
like
that
civil liberties changes. Around the laws.
Yeah, when that sort of stuff changes, or Roe v Wade or whatever in America. It's weird how we know American case law better than our own. But when that stuff changes, it has only resulted in like an evolution of the way that Black people have been marginalised or oppressed through the legal system. And then I think about, say here, for example, the 1967 referendum that was used, like that referendum enabled something like the Northern Territory intervention to happen. So we we have to think about the different ways that white supremacy will come back and bite us, which is hard. Like, it's this really terrible burden for black people to have to bear. It's like a game of chess, and you have to think the worst of your opponent and think 10 decades ahead or whatever. So I think, like, legislation is not a proxy for society. I think that's one thing we can't. It doesn't necessarily mean that society is going to get any better, is one thing. And this legislation change, like changing the Summary Offences Act, will not result in less cops necessarily, will not result in less racist cops. So it absolutely needs to change, but I think we need to, and I think about the role that the media play in this. Like, we need to be sharper and not fall into frames of like a few bad apples instead of critiquing the entire institution. So I think, and also what April said as well, like, we need to shift things from being legal issues to thinking about them in terms of health. Yeah. And like, I think that's a really cool thing that this campaign is doing. It's not just like, it's not thinking about, okay, what about now? Like, what about the future? I think we all need to be thinking like that. Does that make sense?
That's totally makes sense to me.
And, you know, back after the Royal Commission, it was actually nearly abolished. So, you know, like the police and the government, they were actually on board to abolish this law, but it was the local councils that sort of pushed back on it. So that was directly after the Royal Commission, so obviously the pressure was on them to do something. But then you fast forward to now and how much control the police and the government have over our mob, and they're the ones that are like, no, hang on, you know, like, if we abolish this, then people are going to be at risk, when that's actually not the case. You know, it's actually going to be safer for our mob, and you know, that's for non-Indigenous people too, because it's not like only blackfellas are dying from being arrested by this law, you know, but it's just, it's a tool that they can't target us. But the scary thing is they're going to pop something else back in as what they've done in all the other states. And it's exactly right. We just need to think strategically in how and what they replace that with, and, you know, the argument that we can make to make sure that it isn't something else that is resulting in a death in custody.
Like, just like that evolution of police power, I think that's what we have to. I was talking with Amy Maguire about it in terms of black media. We've lost, like, over the years, we've kind of lost like black-owned media with things like Tracker and that sort of thing kind of not around anymore. So what that means is you don't have as many kind of black minds looking at policy, which I find policy so dull, but we need our black minds on that to figure out what it all means for us all, and also with legislation changes, because these white devils are sneaky. They are not going to give up their power. They will only change the way in which they have control over our lives, and we have to have people to spot it. I think, cynical, but it's true.
It is.
So, yeah, I agree with what you're saying. The fact is that the law is the controlling punitive measure that is used against, you know, people of colour and other people in low socioeconomic issues, that they wouldn't be in their predicament if we look at the historical issues for Indigenous people. You know, the laws are developed in this country to basically control Aboriginal people from day one. So we need to look at those, and also the reality is, as previously mentioned by both of my colleagues here, that the underlying issues are the things that we really need to address, and that you know, incarceration and those issues should be the last resort, as everyone says in research, you know, Royal Commission.
Well, they should just be abolished.
Yeah, and then, but the reality is that, you know, health, Indigenous people men die 17 years earlier than non-Indigenous men. You know, our morbidity rate's a bit better than what it was, but it's still very high. Education, you know, in the Territory, kids are coming out of high school with grade 3 education, and it just continues on. And you know, if we're incarcerating our women faster than we ever did, and our children, it's like we're going back to extermination, assimilation, and then basically denial that there's an issue So I just think that, again, we need our non-Indigenous friends to help us, and these are the real issues. Governments always go to the punitive measure first and not willing to really address the issues that are at hand, that are facing not only Indigenous people. If we fix things for Indigenous people, we'll fix things for the majority of everybody else. So, I mean, working in the criminal justice system for forever, you just, I worked in the Legal Aid Commission, and I see non-Indigenous people with the same issues and facing the same, not as many as Aboriginal people, but facing the same issues. So,
yeah, I think we're probably getting into the questions time. So it was just fascinating to hear such powerful responses and really insightful, because it's not an easy fix just changing the laws. We need to change the way that institutions operate. We need to change the culture within, and hopefully there will be the better outcomes that we all want. Maybe we should open it up for questions. Is there someone with a microphone? Yeah. If there are First Nations people here, there is a preference that we give first dibs on questions to any of you. But if there is no one willing, then whoever wants to put their hand up first, we'll hand it over for questions now.
Please be a question.
Hey guys, thank you so much for opening up for questions. First of all, I just want to ask to the crowd, is there anybody here that actually is in a position in policy or in a position in the media where they could make something, make a difference, make a change as to what's being discussed today? If there's anybody here in policy, if there's anybody here in media who's in a powerful position, who has obviously the power to make a change here, is there anybody here? Could you put your hands up, please?
Oh, come on. Surely.
So that was like low-key for my own curiosity, but also to make a point. Wow, thanks for coming along. My question to the panel, and I really appreciate everything that's been said today. The question was, how do we bring people to the table that actually have the power to make a policy change? I understand that this is a big community. As a society, we have so many changes to make. And coming over here from Aotearoa, I have some pretty weird feelings about coming to a country where the connection with culture is just, there is nothing. It really, really disgusts me. But obviously I haven't got that first, experience of that. How do we bring people to the table that have the power to make these changes policy-wise? Obviously, community-wise is a bit of a bigger long-term issue. We can start with our friends and family and work out that way. When it comes to bringing people to the table that actually have the power to make a change, how do we make that happen? Do you have any suggestions in your expertise in law, etc., how we can encourage people to come to these sorts of discussions to make a change? One person in a room full of people, I don't know how many people are here, but I think that's pretty ridiculous.
I'm sure there's Victorian police in the room. I'm sure there's at least two at least. No, I'm serious. Yeah. Vic Polar in the room.
Look, I just think if there's people that actually want to make a change, if they wanted to make a change, they would actually initiate themselves to do that and put the steps in place to be able to do it. Usually, there are some people, that are in the government that are pushing for the abolishment, but then they're nervous about the blowback that will come from other organisations and, from Vic Police. So I think that it gets to a point where, these fellas need to stop being scared about, the backlash that they're going to get, and just, do they need to do the right thing? Because this is a major issue. People are actually dying. I've lost my mum, my kids have lost their grandmother, and, this mum died in December 2017, and it still feels like it was yesterday because, we're having to relive it and push for change all the time. And, it wasn't until 6 months that we found out why mum had passed away. And because of the way that the system is to keep us silent all the time, no one actually knew that mum's death was a death in custody until the first directions hearing, which was was it a year? It was a year. So that to me speaks volumes. You know, if you wanted to make a change, you would, one, stop silencing us and actually, you know, stick your hand up to help for the things that we're asking.
So there's been some positive things over the former years with obviously marriage equality, the freedom of speech stuff, the 18C, where I was working at a national level at the time, and a lot of the other minority groups, powerful minority groups, the Jewish fraternity and that, we all came together and really put pressure on government around that. And we also utilised some of the big NGOs, memberships to write to their member and stuff like that. But it's fairly scary with the election result. Puts that back a bit, but I think I keep saying it, a bit of a broken record, but I think it's really up to our non-Indigenous friends to really start standing up and helping out. I mean, if we can move marriage equality, don't go back into your homes and forget about your First Nations people. It's time that you show some leadership and help us.
In addition to what everyone else has said, I think there's a few things. One, we need to really get around families who've been affected by this. So I think the question you asked was like, who works in policy or who has like this kind of power or whatever. Like, I don't necessarily believe in like electoral democracy is not my jam at all. I think it's obviously a failure. But, everyone here's a voter, everyone here's a member of somebody's electorate, so, like, it's very possible to set up meetings or whatever. But you also all have money. Like, you're here at the Wheeler Centre on a Wednesday night. I'm guessing we're all, like, fairly middle class in the room. So you have money, you have resources to give to families who might need legal fees covered or might need, money for other things to connect with other people who've experienced the same thing. So there are very material things you can do to support Black families who are going through this pain. And right now, Auntie Tanya Day's family needs people to get behind them, particularly, as other dates in the inquest are around. So that's a thing. Also, for those who work in the community sector, and I'm guessing there's a few in the room, aside from our Vic Pol friends, I think it's like police, we have to really think about what police do. And so if they're kind of our one-stop shop for things like homelessness or kind of like social inequity, that's who people call. So we need coalitions, I guess, based on or led by people with lived experience to really lead the way in how we deal with social issues that aren't addressed by police officers. I think, yeah. Anyway, I could ramble on all night, but give your money and fuck cops. Yeah. Not sex with cops, you know what I mean.
And I'll just add the power of community involvement, from mob and non-mob, and, the media as well, because the government, the police, no one was obviously going to stick their hand up and be like, hey, we failed in our duty of care and, Tanya Day has died ultimately because we have failed her. So, it has really come down to the community really advocating and, as a family, we're just so grateful, and Sis has actually done a lot of work and, gone out into the community at events, making sure that the petition's out there. So, if people want to make a change, it's about, actually being on the ground and seeing what our people are facing, what we're dealing with, and that's, around Mum's campaign, but that's, there's a massive list of issues that we're facing. So it's just about, getting involved and making sure that, you inform yourself with everything so you know where you can help.
Yeah. Do you want to talk to the petition and where people can find that?
Yeah, so we've got 2 petitions. One is online, and that's at Action Network. So if you just type in like Tanya Day petition for public drunkenness, that'll pop up. We also have a paper petition that we will table to Parliament. So they're different, so you still need to actually do both. So the petition's down the back and you can sign that. And if you wanted to actually take a copy, you can and get that signed, like, whether it be event, sporting clubs, even your workplace, and you can get that back to the Human Rights Law Centre or even VALS. That would be really helpful. So I just keep repeating myself. It's just making sure that everyone is aware of Mum's story and really pushing that out. There's also a Facebook page that I've started. It's Remember Her Name, Tanya Louise Day. And that I just share most of her stories and the media outlets and a few other things on there. So, jump on there and share that page so everyone can actually keep up to date with the campaign. And really, it's the way of the world now, isn't it? Social media and everything. So just, share her story, share the petition, and just, we would really appreciate anybody's support in making sure that that gets pushed out, because we've got to wait till NAIDOC. Obviously, all the blackfellas are going to be there to support us, so we'll try and boost the petition around that time. So at the end of July, that's the cut-off. So push it out before then.
Yeah, and so as supporters, allies here, take a copy of the petition, take it home, take it to your workplace, get some signatures and tell people the truth of what's happening out there. Read a bit more about the court case and understand the issues that the family are trying to really raise there in a public sphere and get the political will to change laws and policies. We've probably got time for one more question, if anyone's burning to ask something.
It's on? Okay. I just wanted to ask you guys how you thought that the policy could actually, or how you have faith that the policy is actually going to do anything. Because it kind of seems like if you got rid of the law of public drunkenness and you didn't replace it with anything, cops are still going to target First Nations people. They're going to make up a reason. I mean, she was asleep on a train. Like, she wasn't doing anything. She was asleep. And in the same way that they could be like, oh yeah, public drunkenness, they could go up to her and be all like, freak her out, and then, she'll respond freaked out because they're scary, and then like make up some other reason to lock her up and to lock up people. So I kind of feel like the whole public drunkenness isn't, or the policy around public drunkenness.
I guess, the question really goes to the other...
And systematic racism is kind of the thing that we need to destroy.
Just going to jump in here. Thank you. Obviously, and we can do 2 things at once. It is much easier to change that legislation than it is to end white supremacy in this country. So we know, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but at the time of Auntie Tanya's death, the ratio of black women to white women arrested for this offence was 10-1. Is that right?
Yeah, it was over. It was over 11 times more likely.
So obviously, yes, they're going to find reasons to arrest us, and that's why I'm saying, let's be smart about it. But this is one of the means in which they do that. And it doesn't, obviously we're not going to abolish prisons overnight. We're not going to dismantle the police force overnight, but we do need to chip away at the different apparatuses of the state or the mechanisms that allow us to be oppressed. So I don't think it's let's not do this, because this is also an opportunity to have a movement and get people really critical about the role that police play in our lives. So I think we have to see this as for someone like you, see it as an opportunity, not just I'm not going to do anything because we should be addressing racism. Sorry.
Completely agree. This is one step that we're taking. And, obviously there's a huge number of steps that are going to, put an end towards Aboriginal deaths in custody. But, we're not naive. We know that the police are going to use something else to target our people. It's just how we're going to handle that and the things that we're going to put in place to make sure that we can, reduce the risk of us losing our lives.
That already happens anyway. As a former criminal lawyer, police throw that many charges on you, so they get you with one. So the reality is that that happens already. And as we spoke all night about, is that it's all these underlying issues that we need to look at, and how do we address those, and engage with Aboriginal people to assist to address those, is really the issue. And it's about breaking down the systemic beliefs of non-Indigenous people in this country and the systems that are in place that basically target Indigenous people, people of colour, and again, like I said, low socioeconomic. And like I've said, and others on here have said, that there's people already doing that, but how do we make governments accountable for ignoring these, expensive reviews that, we're tired of talking about them, and we're tired of seeing them. And again, it just can't be blackfellas harping on about them. I think that's what it comes down to. I mean, we can all go away and appreciate you all coming tonight, but the reality is it's in your hands. And you can walk over the bridge and you can do something on Reconciliation Day, but we need more than that. And I think it gets a little bit frustrating, but we just want to see some real commitment to making change for blackfellas in this country. And I think you need to have a real good look in the mirror and see whether, and as everyone else said on here, go and find out what the issues are and what the realities are for Aboriginal people in this country. Because I can tell you right now, it's not easy for an Aboriginal person to live in this country. And that's all I really want to say about it.
Can I also just say, regardless of race, regardless of colonisation, it should not be illegal to be drunk in public. That is just fundamentally, this is about us because we're unfairly targeted, but this is about our liberties or what, I don't know.
It's just basic human rights.
Yeah, it's, and we don't actually have the right to drink. I read Grog Wars recently and I think it was in there. Anyway, but if you go to any, say, European country or whatever, it is quite acceptable to be drinking in public. So regardless of race, it actually should be just abolished because it's like an overreach. Anyway.
Yeah, totally agree.
Completely agree.
Yeah, I think that we're up. The thing's flashing red at me. It's like, gone, stop now. Thank you for coming. This is, I was just so excited to hear from such an amazing panel and really are experts in these issues. And it's just sad because it's like we've all been touched by the laws and policies, both in terms of our family experiences, but personally. And I'm just so grateful to have been on the panel with you guys tonight. Put your hands together for such an amazing panel. I just want to say, still going. Please, if you haven't signed the petition, go and sign the petition. If you've got the capacity and maybe you want to do something, how about you take a couple of the empty petitions and you take it to your workplaces, you go and see some family and friends and you tell them about what we're trying to do here. Thank you for coming tonight.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.